Hi everyone and welcome to Hit the Apex. It's that time of year again where we're looking back at the first half of the season. No, I'm not going to do the Bon Jovi lyric about being halfway there, so let's just press on with it anyway.
Well, it wouldn't be right because we're more than halfway there in actuality. 12 down, 9 to go, so it
12
wouldn't
out
make
of
sense.
Well, how do you half 21 anyway? So yeah, thanks Baden for that. But it's hard to believe, we're already halfway through another season of Formula One. A lot's happened, a lot for us to look back on. The year of the Halo, let's start off as well. It was the big thing coming into this season was the introduction of that head protection device, and let's say, maybe through second practice session or third practice session in Melbourne, we really didn't care much for it or had much notice, so it goes to show you how little it's had as far as being a talking point of the season, even though it was really talked about coming into the year. But Halo aside, we've got a lot to talk about. As per usual, we've broken it down into sort of key narratives for this season as well. Let's talk about the championship battle. Let's talk about the best of the rest, the politics, and all the silly season stuff as well, which went into overdrive really over the weekend with news of Daniel Ricciardo's moving on to Renault, leaving Red Bull, and basically where does everyone else sit after that. So plenty to discuss, but the championship itself, the fight for five as it's been called, two four-time world champions, Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, fighting for a fifth title. It started off really, there was a lot of hype around it, and now we've 12 races later, 5 wins to Hamilton in favour of him with a 24-point lead in the championship, and Sebastian Vettel with 4 wins, and let's be honest, a lot of work to do in the second half of the season.
Yeah, it was a really odd way that we approached the summer break there. Ferrari looked for all intents as though they were romping away, and then the catastrophe of Germany and the setback with the weather at Hungary's put them right on the back foot, and credit to Mercedes there when we saw, especially from the earlier season, they've just fought their way back into this championship, and suddenly when we get back underway in a few weeks, Ferrari's got the catching up to do. But if last year wasn't, a pretty similar situation in terms of the championship outlook, but we're set for a cracking finish as long as Ferrari can be on its game.
Yeah, so, I've basically said throughout the whole year that even though, Ferrari's doing really well at the moment, it's going to be the second half of the season which is going to be more telling, and that's basically where it fell away for them last year. Spa, Monza weren't that great races for them, and then Singapore basically was that turning point where they had that turn one collision, and it was all over from there. So what will happen this time out? Ferrari, they've got the fastest car, according to everyone, on track. Can they come out in Spa, Monza and get those wins? They're going to need one of those 2 wins if Vettel's going to be back in the hunt, and maybe hope that Hamilton runs into some bad luck as well. And talking about Lewis Hamilton, he's had a, let's say, negative demeanour for most of the season, you could say, even just starting from Melbourne, where he just didn't seem positive. He's the reigning world champion, yet, he seemed a little distracted. And could you say that, in a way, it was quietly feeding Ferrari and the buzz around them that they had? They weren't quickest in practice, but they came out and won the race, making the call on the virtual safety car, get the strategy right, and they pipped Mercedes in the end to that win in Australia, and then same, I guess, in Bahrain as well to an extent. So, I guess you could say Hamilton's negative behaviour really feeding Ferrari, feeding the positivity around them.
Yeah, Hamilton wasn't without his chances earlier on, and it is hard to believe that they looked quite dominant, both Mercedes at Australia, and it was not, if not for that safety car, virtual safety car, it would have been Hamilton's victory at Akanda, but that took him a long time psychologically to regenerate. And you even go to Baku there when he was really struggling after a poor start, poor qualifying, and again fortuitous as a result of the safety car, and on that occasion he benefited, and slowly he's been able to rejuvenate that campaign, but his state of negativity has persisted throughout, and it's quite a paradox to where he finds himself in the standings, that he's just been so discontent and really just looks like he'd rather be somewhere else when he's being, on paper at least, competitive as ever, but there's still a lot of cracks beneath that surface.
Yeah, indeed there are. And conversely with Ferrari, I guess you could say that the lack of hype in their pre-season as well, we didn't really sit there talking about them as much as we have in previous seasons, I guess quietly getting the job done. And I think that's worked for them, hasn't it? Because previously Ferrari would come out with all these expectations, they'd be quite bombastic and very bullish about their prospects, but we didn't really hear from them much. And then I guess we heard about how they've enforced this media ban as well at the races too. They're not going to talk to the media in the traditional ways, whereas they'll just issue their own press releases or hold their own press conferences at their behest. So the fact that they're doing that means, quietly under the radar, they've done all these things to make their car better. Illegal, that's probably another question to talk about as well. A lot of people raising the prospect of possibly Ferrari's cars illegal with the first they had the wing mirrors banned that they mounted on the Halo, then now this battery thing which is supposedly giving them the more power than Mercedes. Is their MGUH or whatever legal and everything? So I guess it's probably just hearsay, and the rivals are just genuinely bewildered as to how they've done this. So, and any time in Formula One that happens, the best thing to do would be to raise it as a legality.
It does seem as though that's the best way, rather than the opponents having their own financial input there and millions down the drain for what is really a precious few tenths of a second. But credit must be given to Ferrari there. They really found a bit of a march on an area which really it's hard to believe from where Mercedes started at the commencement of the hybrid era. They had all those bases covered, and for all the talk of last season, Ferrari choking under pressure, they've been able to assert themselves this year, and if not for those moments going wrong, and Sebastian Vettel perhaps being a little bit too hot on the gas in particular moments, they'd be very comfortable. So it's a bit of a weird spot that we find that season, where Ferrari is currently trailing both championships, but they do feel as though the confidence is there of very much a title-winning outfit there.
Yeah, they do, and I guess it's about, even though they've got the faster car, it's about execution, and that's something that they're still lacking in, it seems, whether it's getting those pit stops right. We've seen the finger troubles, and in Hungary was probably lost because of another bad pit stop for Sebastian Vettel. So it's that execution, but also just, we talked about it so many times in during the season, is making the least amount of mistakes, and Mercedes is guilty of this too. So, while Mercedes are making mistakes, Ferrari's job is to make no mistakes, but they've gone and made their own mistakes. So that's why Mercedes then, on the days that they're fast and dominant, they're going to take the maximum points. So unfortunately, this is probably the way the championship's going to be decided.
You'd say that Ferrari's poor days are much worse than Mercedes. They always seem to optimise a result, jag a second or a third, whereas Ferrari's off days sees them either maybe 5th, 6th or retirement, and they're the points that really could be pivotal. It's only talking maybe 6 or 8, but very fine line the way that it stands. And Lewis Hamilton, all that whinging that he does have, he's always been right up there, whereas Vettel's had quite a few of those races where he's ended up being right down the field when he's been probably leading more often than not this season.
Yeah, and Germany was certainly one of those days where it was, I guess Kimi ended up on the podium, which was something that they could salvage out of the day. But the fact that, he retired there, mistake of his own, but then it's sort of cancelled out by the fact that Mercedes had the double mechanical retirement in Austria, which lost them all the points. But then Ferrari, as you say, couldn't capitalise and actually go for the win in that situation. It was Max Verstappen who won on the day, but Ferrari were still on the podium. So it's on those days where they've got to get the 25 points as opposed to getting the 18 or the 15. So coming into the second half of the season, mechanics will be a big thing as well, because looking at the power unit allocations, only 3 per season. So who's going to choke and take the power unit penalties first? You'd think Ferrari have been very quietly optimistic about where they're at as far as reliability is concerned, and so far we haven't really seen much reliability problems on their end, whereas Mercedes, Austria was that bitter pill for them to swallow. So, could we see a repeat of Malaysia 2016 where, basically that one race, one engine failure turns the championship on its head?
The way it stands, Ferrari, despite enjoying that reliability, they can't afford for it to be anytime soon. So they would be hoping that really see the way that the weekend turns on a dime with some weather intervening like it did at Hockenheim and Budapest. That, I don't know, you think that Mercedes are more comfortable when it does rain, so you're hoping for really hot conditions to come to the fore on race day when the Mercedes really do seem to struggle. So I think that they're probably due for some luck there. But as it stands, Ferrari, they really need to just be bulletproof all the way through to Abu Dhabi, because it just hasn't quite fallen their way in those 1% moments.
Yeah, but still, 3 power units is going to be a stretch. So it's not a question of if they're going to take power unit penalties, it's going to be when. And I think maybe in the next couple of races, Spa, Monza, where it's probably not as the penalties aren't as severe, really, that we might see them do that. I mean, how good would that be if both Hamilton and Vettel took power unit penalties on the same weekend and we see them fight their way through the field to come back to the front? But Silverstone, I think, was probably the best race so far this season where we saw these two fighting together. And I guess that little moment in the race towards the end where we had 2 versus 2, both Ferraris, both Mercedes fighting each other, and ultimately Seb came back to win that one, which was great for the championship and everything. So, can we see more of that in the second half of the season? Because as A, it's entertaining, B, you want the championship to be won on who's the better driver, not because of all these other external variables.
Yeah, it was a very interesting one, and the narrative going around that it was Hamilton's race to lose, particularly at Silverstone, even though he was fairly and squarely beaten off the line. That didn't seem to get much attention, unfortunately, particularly from a certain television provider. We won't go into that quite now, but you could say that as far as it goes, as seeing Hamilton versus Vettel fighting over a piece of racetrack, it's been intriguing that they probably haven't been there together so frequently. They've had their own internal scraps going on, which is gone one way or another, like the Hockenheim when Hamilton was nowhere and Vettel was out the front, even though he did look shaky, and then it was too late for him to do much at Hungary. So they're both going about their business on a given weekend, getting the points, and when it does come down to it, it'll be really intriguing if push comes to shove, if they've really got to get their elbows out. There might be some real spite injected, which probably hasn't been the case since Azerbaijan last season. That was the low point for relations between the two, and otherwise they've been largely running separate fights in the championship this season.
Yeah, so in that second half, it's going to be really telling if they get to come together on track and everything. So we'll leave it at that as far as the championship is concerned. Really hard to make any predictions just yet about who will win. It's just going to be about who makes the least mistakes and everything. And hopefully it goes down to the wire in Abu Dhabi for that. But moving it on, it's been a case of lonely bulls and number twos behind the two championship guys. Red Bull, of course, much talk about them potentially being contenders this year, and that slowly fizzled into nothing in the first couple of races, as it always does. But then also the number 2 drivers as well in both Ferrari and Mercedes camps. If it wasn't already instilled in everyone, it was after the Hungarian Grand Prix, with Valtteri Bottas being consigned to the wingman role. Of course, wingman hurts for Bottas, what he said after the race. And I guess I said this last week too, you know, while it might seem fine for Kimi Raikkonen to be in that role, Bottas has been he's still a young driver. He's won 3 Grand Prix. He's been very quick. He could be a potential world champion, but this year he's just been hurt by bad luck. You know, if you thought last year was really good, you know, this year's just been the complete opposite for him. The DNF in Baku probably summarises his whole season as being pretty dismal. He was on to win that race, and then, of course, hitting that piece of debris coming down the straight or whatever, near the end of the race too. The checkered flag was only a few laps away. And yeah, there you go. That's the race win taken from him. And since then, we haven't really seen him in a position where he could come back and win.
Yeah, look to Paul Ricard. He probably had a good chance to be competitive there. You look to Silverstone. He was second to the dying laps and his tyres fell off. Then you look to Hungary. He was put into the wingman role. He was second until the final few laps, and then he had to pit again. So he probably could have won 3 or 4 races. But at this stage, after those sentiments from Toto Wolff, he just wants to preserve his psyche for the rest of this season. It'd be a good confidence booster if you can ever scratch a win together, and probably just reset for 2019 when the scores are back to 0. And we know, if nothing else, that he's got the championship calibre within him there, and who knows what Hamilton's mindset will be beyond this season, whether he'll finally be burnt out from being at the top for so long. But it's encouraging that at least he's got that racecraft there and starting to show a little bit more aggression, if nothing else cited by his tactics at Budapest there. He did get a little bit more aggressive, which it was pleasing, even though it didn't work out for him on that occasion. So I think he's really validated something which, even after 3 victories last season, a lot of people thought he was nothing more than a stable number 2 this year. Very, very fine line, and he would be Mercedes guy if things had have just gone a little differently.
Yeah, exactly. And but in the second half, the second quarter of the season, we really didn't see that, you know. And I wonder if it's just got into him mentally now that he is consigned to that role, and whether in the second half of the season, sure, like he may be able to bag a win if it meant that Mercedes would win the race as opposed to Ferrari. But, you know, as far as beating his teammate Lewis Hamilton is concerned, it doesn't look like it's going to happen now. And, you know, Kimi Raikkonen's been in that position for the last couple of years with Ferrari, and I guess we've sort of grown to accept that in a way, because, you know, it doesn't hurt as much with Kimi as it does with Bottas, is because Kimi's actually gone and he's achieved like 20 race wins. He's got that world championship.
And he's 38.
He's nearing the end of his career too. So whilst it'd be nice to see Kimi have some success, for Bottas at that age and at that point in his career, you don't want him to be burnt out as a number 2 this early, given the potential that he has yet to offer.
And you do see now, we'll touch on it a bit more shortly, but Daniel Ricciardo's taken that plunge, and he won't be forced into that number 2 role ongoing at Red Bull. And for Bottas, he's got that renewal for a season with the option for the second. So it'll be interesting to see what goes on over the next 12 months, whether he sees any potential there to win a title with Mercedes, or he's forced to look somewhere else if he's ever going to have that leading man status within a team which is capable of championships.
Yeah, exactly. So we might come to Red Bull now as well then, and Red Bull have largely been running in their own championship, you could say. They've had 3 wins this season, early in the season, mind you, compared to last year, but it's been really, you could say, masked by all the errors that we had with Max Verstappen in the early part of the season, and also reliability failures on both cars. It's just shocking. We laughed about McLaren and Honda last year, but Red Bull and Renault this year have been absolutely shocking. And of course, now we know that Red Bull and Renault will not be together for 2019. Red Bull will be with Honda. But as far as this season's concerned, it's just been terrible. And we saw in the last 2 races to Germany where Daniel Ricciardo had to make a power unit change, ended up not finishing the race, DNF. Same with Max Verstappen in Hungary. So, you know, what do they do for the rest of the season? They basically just have to collect as many points as they can, try and bag a win if they can as well. But yeah, they're not really racing for any better position that they're currently in, which is third in the Constructors' Championship.
You'd think the next opportunity will come at Singapore, but you never know. The way that it all worked out for them at China and then Austria, that if they're in the right place and some misfortune strikes for Mercedes or Ferrari, that they're not far away, but the reliability does seem to have coincided with that announcement of the Honda switch, and who knows where Ricciardo will be placed internally priority-wise now that that announcement is there, that he'll be on his way out. And you'd think that based on the first season with Honda, it's going to be a continuation of that in 2019, so they can't be expecting too much too soon, and they're probably got to be looking to the longer picture as well. 2021, in whichever shape the new regulations do take effect, that's the moment when it really seems realistic that Mercedes and Ferrari will be knocked off their perch.
Yeah, by Red Bull or Renault or whoever, so really disappointing to see once again that Red Bull have sort of had that, I mean, where I said Ferrari didn't really have that weight of expectation or that hype around them coming into the season to fight for the World Championship. Red Bull always do. They always build it up around themselves that, yeah, we are a top team and we're going to take it to the big boys ahead, and unfortunately it didn't really amount to anything this season. So, yeah, whether they can add to their tally of 3 wins as it is with any more remains to be seen. The other thing you said, I agree with. What's the position of Daniel Ricciardo going to be internally as well? Are they going to favour Max Verstappen when it comes to strategy, whether it comes to winning the race? If Verstappen's in a better position, are they going to favour him? Or does Daniel just be his own man, you know, now that he's not bound to the team as far as being there next year? Why he just goes rogue and takes things into his own hands, especially if they're in a situation like they were in Baku where there was fireworks.
Yeah, I don't think Ricciardo really owes the team anything. He's got to race for himself at a certain point, and the way things stand, I think that Ricciardo and Verstappen get along well enough, notwithstanding the moment at Azerbaijan, but they both understand that they've just got to take their opportunities, and they don't come around too often, you could say, especially when the Renault Power Unit's always getting in their way. So I think that really any semblance of doing what's best when they're probably entrenched in that P3 for this season, it won't really be the forefront of their mind.
Yeah, exactly. So that's basically summarises their season to date, and what to expect from them for the rest of the year just remains to be seen. But coming to the best of the rest now, and of course behind those top 3 teams, it's always a very interesting battle, isn't it? And this year we really talked up the likes of Renault and McLaren and Haas, because they're the teams with the bigger budgets that could make the bigger inroads. 2 of the 3 have not surprised us, but have upheld those expectations. Renault, of course, they edged ahead of Haas in the championship for 4th. They've only had a best finish this year of 5th as well, with Nico Hülkenberg on a couple of occasions. But, you know, from where they were in 2016, when they first returned to the sport as a manufacturer, they've shown solid progress, and it just keeps building and building. And I guess with the arrival of Daniel Ricciardo for next year as well, it just goes to show you how positive the team is and how much they're building toward what they're building towards. And you said before we came on air, 2020 could be a year where Ricciardo and Renault could challenge for the championship, potentially, that is.
And you see a lot of the best drivers, they bring out the best in a package, even if they're not quite on scratch with the class of the field, like we did see. Obviously Hamilton coincided with the new regs a year later. Michael Schumacher more prevalently, though. That was about 5 years before he enjoyed the best car on the grid, but within that first 12 to 18 months he was putting the Ferrari in contention for titles, and Renault's quickly risen up the ranks since the start of 2017, so with a really stable lineup there with himself and Nico Hülkenberg. Who knows beyond 2019 whether the German will remain there, but as it stands, they're going to have a really a youthful lineup, if nothing else. They're really both entering the prime of their careers, and I think that next season the target will be podiums, if not for for Ricardo, then Hulkenberg would like to finally jag one. But I can sense that Ricardo, he'll get a victory next season. He just makes it happen.
Yeah, so that just shows you the progress of Renault, that within 3 years, I guess 3 years was the plan that they laid out in 2016. So, they'll be in the race-winning position next year. But Haas, their gains over the off-season, it's astonishing. And the fact that, I guess, a lot of their results this year have been masked by the fact that they've had inconsistency. And we go back to Australia, where they were in that position where they could have had 4th and 5th in the first race, scored all those points, but the double DNF with the double pit stop failure, basically. And then the other thorn in their side has been their incumbent stalwart driver, Romain Grosjean, who has only had 2 points finishes, I think, this season, or 1 point scoring finish, sorry. And
no, he got the second at Germany, I'm pretty sure, didn't he?
He would have. Oh, yeah, he got the 4th in Germany too. So the fact that, they're in a position now where they have a car that can score points at every race, but they're being hurt by, a driver who we've all regarded in the past as being a really quick driver and someone who once upon a time was going to end up in a top team. Unfortunately, it's not come for them, and it's been Kevin Magnussen who's been getting those results.
And a lot of the talk now with the instability of Force India, that seat, even if it wasn't already very much up for grabs, and you'd think that it's going to take a lot of consistency from Grosjean there to shore up not just a last-minute reprieve at Haas, but an alternative spot on the grid. As shame as it is to say, when you had that talk maybe a couple of years ago about being next in line for a Ferrari berth, it's just petered away, and he's returned to that status he found himself in 2012 when he earned that nutcase reputation.
Yeah, well, basically, who hasn't been in line for a Ferrari role on the grid at the moment? But yeah, no, I agree where he has basically turned into that nutcase again, it seems. Not on the first lap, though, however, as Mark Webber said it. But
run for the hills.
It's just basically been a disappointment for Grosjean, and for a team that could possibly be closer to Renault in the championship. And Renault haven't been perfect by any stretch as well. Carlos Sainz, you say, has probably been a bit underwhelming this season, a bit half-baked, just doesn't seem to... I mean, Nico Hulkenberg's a great driver, and we would have thought that they'd be a lot closer to each other on the racetrack, which hasn't been the case. And Hungary was definitely an example of that, where in the wet he qualified 5th for Renault, but then dropped back on the first lap, and then I guess McLaren beat them as far as strategy is concerned, so he ended up 9th in the race. So yeah, it'd take a big second half of the season for Sainz to really impress, but we'll talk about Sainz anyway with our silly season, because he's basically the next big player in the silly season for next year.
Yeah, it'd be a shame for Sainz' career to really fall off after just that solitary season, as it's now come to light with Renault. So he's got a few options there. You wouldn't think he's going to fall off the grid, but whether he's going to be in a lesser car for 2019, it just shows you the way things work out from what he had at Toro Rosso. This was seen as maybe a halfway house to getting himself extricated from the Red Bull empire, the claws the tentacles that they wrap around you until you've done your years of service. So I think that he's had his moments, you could say, but very anonymous, and he's been consistent in qualifying, but on Sundays he can't quite convert where Hulkenberg can, and it's just that amusement that the German there still hasn't got that podium. So I think the true test for Hulkenberg will be alongside Daniel Ricciardo, and we can finally make that true assessment on where he does stack up.
Yeah, exactly. So Force India, we touched on it just before. They're still getting the biggest bang for their buck as far as scoring results are concerned. And yeah, they've certainly fell behind considering those guys like Renault, Haas made the progress over the off-season. But they're the only team in the midfield that's got a podium so far this season. And that came again in Baku, courtesy of Sergio Perez, who just keeps racking them up for Force India. But I guess that's all been overshadowed this year by the fact that they've had that financial trouble, and basically hit boiling point in Hungary because the team went into administration, and since then we've learnt that they're exiting administration before the next race, of course, with Lawrence Stroll coming in to buy out the team with a consortium of people there too. So it's positive for Force India going into the future, but it's a situation that they should have never been in the first place. Just to paraphrase what Sergio Perez wrote on Twitter the other day.
Yeah, it's quite inconceivable when you consider how consistent they have been, really on an upward trend since about 2013, and then stable in that P4, if not in the standings. And in most races, they were the next best after the big three. And even this season, for what has been very much under duress, they've punched above their weight. And that podium at Azerbaijan, you can see it's not like they've completely fallen off the rails. So at least now everyone is secure. It's not like there's going to be people being dismissed without pay, and hopefully they retain the same crew, probably having an overdose on maple syrup if nothing else, now that the Canadian flavour's in there. And obviously you're going to see a pretty big influence with Senior Stroll there and his son Lance almost inevitably coming on board from next season. But it will be a good chance for him to gauge where exactly he stands, since he's been lumped with a pretty shambolic Williams this season. So that might be a blessing for him, if nothing else, just to see what he's made of, and however it affects either Perez or Ocon. They've got to look for their own alternatives, at least this iteration, whatever it's named next year. The identity and the spirit which started with Jordan in 1991 lives on.
Yeah, Force Canada, maybe, as some people have said. But they've been it's been a solid package, capable of scoring points and not having as much development as the other guys have, as we've said. So, they're doing a great job, but now having that injection into them of cash and stability for the future. This could be a team, does it move up the grid or does it stay in the midfield? But as far as this season's concerned, they've done another great job, and it'd be great to see them score more points and more results. And they've got two great drivers in Esteban Ocon and Sergio Perez, so could Ocon possibly be yet to score a podium this season? We'll just have to wait and see. It's possible.
Yeah, I don't think the development side, if they wanted to push, they could, but they'd probably be wise to turn it towards 2019 at this stage. And as it stands, they always seem to capitalise when things turn a bit shambolic, so they'll still pick up a good wad of points, and who knows if they can still contend for that P4. But bottom line is that it's all going to be irrelevant heading into the future. It's just a good sign that they can really look a bit longer term than probably the last 5 years, the way it's been with Vijay Mallya and Subrata Roy there. You don't know from season to season which crisis they're going to lurch to.
Yeah, so without the crisis hanging over their head now, what do we expect to see from Force India? Are they going to be? They're probably going to be better than they are currently, so that's going to be really positive to see. And for an independent as well in Formula One, I know everyone disses Haas because they're not really truly independent because of the Ferrari type, but Force India, they've been on their own for most of it. They've had some assistance from Mercedes, but they've largely done it all on their own, which is, I guess, what you really want to see.
Yeah, it's as much as you can ask for them. In the way that F1's currently structured, there's not really any other alternative unless things drastically change from 2021, and whether it means these other teams are going to get on board and all that talk, whether Williams will more closely align itself with Mercedes as Sauber and Haas have done, really coming in-house with Ferrari there. There's a lot to play out, but for Force India, in any respect, at least they can focus on themselves and the bigger picture there. That's something I'm sure the next 6 months we'll know a lot more. And the silly season, it's easy to get carried away, but it's just a good story when you see so many other teams there. They enter that state of insolvency, and for whatever selfish reason, the owner won't look at any acceptable offer. They're in it for their own benefit, and you see the livelihoods of so many compromised. So this is a rare occasion where good prevails.
Basically, yeah, it's nice to see good prevailing for once in the twisted world of Formula One. But moving it on, McLaren, underwhelming probably the best term to use in this situation to sum up their season. The issues really arising on the car, you could say, and hurting Fernando Alonso, Stoffel Van Dorn. The thought was that, with a Renault power unit this season, it was going to be a transition year, but it wasn't going to be as bad as it has been, with just really deficiencies on the chassis side being exposed, you could say, as a result. And we've been led to believe over the last few years that even though they had the sluggish Honda in there, that they were carrying one of the best chassis on the grid. But, now with a better power unit, it really hasn't come to eventuate for them. And there's, I guess, most of the chatter this season about McLaren has been all the off-track dramas with the exodus of staff that we've had. Eric Boullier, the team boss, has gone. Matt Morris, long-time designer, gone. Tim Goss, technical director, gone, just to name a few. They've recruited a few new people in the likes of Gilles de Ferran, and, of course, in the process of trying to get James Key out of Toro Rosso.
Bit hasty on the gun there. That's one which is very much in progress.
Yeah, well, it is in progress, as I said. But it's just been one of those, another terrible season, you could say. And Fernando Alonso, does he stay or does he go? That's the big question. And Stoffel Van Dorn really just underwhelming once again this season. So what's the scene going to be like at McLaren for next year, and what can they salvage from this season?
A lot of introspection for McLaren, and looking at it retrospectively does make you wonder whether McLaren was being flattered by Honda, or Honda was being really shafted by McLaren, maybe having a package there which just couldn't accommodate the Honda architecture. And you've seen Honda really on a given weekend, they've really been quite pacey, and they've sorted a lot of that reliability out. So for McLaren, it's been a huge wake-up call, and you do have to feel for Stoffel Van Dorn, if not Alonso, who again has blundered, and he thought this was going to be finally the out with Renault to fight, as he did say after Australia, but that hasn't eventuated. But for Van Dorn, he's clearly got no confidence there, and you can't blame him at all to come in under this circumstance. It's going to be a continuation, as it looks at the moment, of Sergio Perez and Kevin Magnussen, who at least in their cases were offered a reprieve, and they've been able to really rehabilitate their careers. So you can only hope Van Dorn, if he is shown the door, that he gets another option, because it'd be a terrible shame from that rap that everyone was giving him ahead of 2017, that he was going to be the next great thing.
Yeah, the next Alan Prost, I guess, was what was said at the time. And Fernando Alonso, I guess there's no doubting the guy's ability, because he'll still score points for you on any given weekend. He can qualify outside the top 10 and then just hustle his way to a result, which is good. But then you have to ask the question all the time, like, if they were in a more competitive car, or if McLaren had a more competitive car, what result could Alonso bag? Because I know that when he was with Ferrari, like, they'd probably have a car that was not as good as the Red Bull or the Mercedes, but just the Alonso factor can still score a podium out of it. So you just got to wonder, if McLaren had a car that was easily on the same pace as the Renault, for example, could his ability on its own be able to jag podiums for him?
Oh, absolutely. You can see that he sniffs an opportunity, and he enters that really aggressive mode, which probably is just hibernating 90% of the time these days amongst that disillusionment. So you would hope that next year, if he does commit, if nothing else presents itself stateside, that deadline they mentioned a few weeks ago seems to be approaching, and it has gone a bit quiet, it must be said. So whatever does happen, you hope that he can at least end his career with something to show, some sort of fluke podium, just so we don't remember his career on 5 years of a whimper.
Yeah, basically, as it has been, it's hard to believe it's been almost that long since he left Ferrari, of course. But moving it on, and we talked about Honda just before, but about on their given weekend, they've shown the signs of improvement, and basically all year with Toro Rosso, they've shown gains from last year. They've had very little in the way of reliability problems, but I guess when they've had, it's been Brendan Hartley who's suffered them majority, and then I guess 4th and 6th for Pierre Gasly there in Bahrain, and then last time out in Hungary. solid results. But yeah, it's just been a tough season, you could say, for Brendan Hartley, who, through no fault of his own, is already on the outer, you could say, for next year, but could yet be saved. But it just goes to show you how brutal that Red Bull driver regime is.
Yeah, it's really been a bit of an awkward one for Toro Rosso. You could almost say a bit of an identity crisis since Danny Kvyat. You see circumstance the way that he was repatriated from Red Bull for 2016 and 2017, just a shattered soul, and clearly that ended his career. Just the way that he was treated, there was no real thought given to the way that he was very promising up until he was gone. Basically, there was very little in it apart from that one or two little race block there with the incidents he had with Vettel at China and Russia in 2016, and that was effectively the end of his career in the competitive sense. And then they had to scramble Toro Rosso to get Gasly in and Hartley in, and then no one else was really viable alternative for this season. And now you've seen with Ricciardo probably shocking a few and making that move, it would seem that Hartley might yet get a stay of execution for 2019, and who knows what his potential is, but you do hope that he gets a clear run at it, because he does seem as though he's finally starting to show a bit more consistency. He looked a bit lost in those earlier races, but now I think he's starting to feel like he belongs there, and the question really will be on Pierre Gasly, whether Red Bull is reticent to learn or they don't learn from the Kvyat experience when their hand was forced, essentially, when we saw Vettel in 2014 move to Ferrari a year early and Kvyat was put straight in the firing line. Whether they feel that Pierre Gasly, after what will be 25 races, is prepared, but the signs are there that it looks as though he's got it there, and you just wonder, if nothing else, the age is of Verstappen and Gasly. They're both going to be 21, 22, whether they feel that's just too young at this point to have two guys really going at it for the title.
Yeah, and the maturity factor from Verstappen is still questionable as well. So, yeah, it's been a tough old one for Toro Rosso, but at the same time, they've shown progress on the Honda side, and certainly something for Red Bull to look forward to now that they're going to be paired with Honda for next season. Sauber, on the other hand, they've had a bit of a renaissance this year. It's been a revival of their form. Charles Leclerc has come in around, sort of with a lot of hype around him, and he certainly lived up to that hype. Like, unfortunately, a lot of those Formula 2 graduates don't really. They come in with that hype. We named Stoffel Van Dorn. Jolyon Palmer was another one who got spat back out after not even a year and a half in the sport. So, yeah, Charles Leclerc has come in 7 out of 12 point scoring races for him, which has been great. He's really shown his teammate Marcus Ericsson, who's bossing that team, and yeah, really on that radar for who knows whether it will be next year, but definitely from 2020 or 2021 will be a Ferrari driver.
And I think in many senses, as great as it would have been to, and it still could happen, end up at Ferrari in 2019, it won't hurt him to have another year, and sure, he'll be really itching to get in there, but he'll have a steep learning curve, and whether it's at Haas or he remains at Sauber, the future is very bright for him.
Yeah, exactly. And rounding it out, I guess, with Williams, they've just had a diabolical season, as we touched, and only an 8th place finish in Baku, which was the only point scoring finish they've had this season, but a combination of financial worries, car troubles as well, just undrivable, as they say. Poor Sergei Sirotkin, making his debut this year, really doesn't have much to work with, you could say. So, where does it go right for William? Where do Williams go in the second half of the season? Is it just going to be more of the same? Lance Stroll probably off to Force India now. So what's the future look like for them? And looking back, how do you rate the first half of the season?
I'd say that overall they've punched above their weight. You could say, Sauber has, but for Williams, they've probably just finally got their act together the last couple of races. They've just shown maybe a bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and you'd hope that maybe if they increase the collaboration with Mercedes there's a bit of a chance to turn things around. They've got to find a way to cover the losses, though, with Martini departing, and now Stroll will be taking his backing surely completely away from Williams and towards Force India. So they're probably freed in that sense of whatever tie-ups they see fit within the Stroll camp, and maybe it gives them a bit more autonomy again. And who knows about those race drivers, whether Kubica finally gets a crack, or whether a George Russell is installed by Mercedes, or dare we say Esteban Ocon there, since that Renault option's now dried up after Ricciardo jumped in. So there's plenty of options out there, and you just hope that they, along with McLaren, just find their way back. And it's going to be a slow process, but you just hope this isn't the beginning of the end.
Yeah, exactly. And talking about those options, let's go straight into silly season mode now, and pointing out that only Mercedes and Renault at this point of the year have confirmed their lineups for 2019. So Hamilton and Bottas, of course, staying. We learnt that in Germany. And then, of course, Ricciardo's signing by Renault confirmed that he and Hulkenberg will be at the team next year. So let's start with Ferrari, and they could yet retain Kimi Räikkönen for another year, but as we said, there's the potential that Leclerc steps up to the team. What would you rather see? Like, given where they're at the moment, you just said before that it wouldn't be a bad thing if Leclerc had another season at Sauber, just because they're a team on the up as well at the moment. So, does Kimi get another season at Ferrari? If not, where does he go? Because he could go back to Sauber potentially, as it's been talked about, or end up in retirement, which seems more likely. And then if there's a seat available at Sauber, does Stoffel Van Dorn, if he loses his drive at McLaren, go to Sauber because he's an ally of the team principal Frederic Vasseur?
Oh, he's food for thought. There's Van Dorn, there's Kubica has been linked, there's been Perez linked at certain points. So
Checo perhaps goes back to his old team at Sauber as well.
A lot of them make sense based on who they know and how it just lines up, as far as it representing like a good chance to perhaps go somewhere quieter. But you can see Sauber's become a lot more attractive over the past 6 months, and it's just a good sign. They're more of a destination outfit than they were for many years there after the highs of 2012, and whether it's led again by Charles Leclerc, or he does that slight switch up to Haas, or he does go straight to Ferrari, at least they're looking a lot more assured of their future. And if it ends up being, say, Stoffel Van Dorn at Sauber, it might be a good place for him just to nurture himself away from really the toxic environment that has been McLaren.
Yeah, and link up with his old pal and Frederic Vasseur, who took him to that F2 title a couple of years ago. Red Bull, as we touched on before, are they going to have Carlos Sainz back? I touch on in an article I'm writing at the moment that it's probably not going to happen, given the acrimony between Helmut Marko and the Sainz family, where Sainz last year said that Red Bull had better promote him sooner or later, or he's going to go elsewhere. Helmut basically laughed at that, and Sainz recently said that his next contract, he desires it to be at least 2 years, which you can understand. And, I guess this is a driver who's spent a lot of his he's still pretty young, but the first part of his career basically in the shadow of Max Verstappen, and now he really has the opportunity to break away from that and break away from Red Bull and show something. And as we said before, it's probably been a bit underwhelming this season from him at Renault, at that halfway house, you said, but if he shores up his position for next year, and McLaren seems like that option for him, whether it's next to Fernando Alonso or not, is that where he defines his career, where he leads perhaps McLaren back in 2021? He's only going to be 26 by that time, so he's still pretty young. It's all about stepping out of the Red Bull shadow, it seems, for Carlos Sainz.
And I think anyone's got to be keen to, as much as Red Bull's competitive, to really see that Verstappen's the anointed one. They'd have to be a little bit desperate, and Sainz might be willing to hedge his bets on McLaren getting its act together 2019, 2020, and who knows whether he could be its leader. If Alonso or Van Dorn or both end up departing, then it might be his real opportunity to become a team leader with someone who's got such an iconic background without being really a prisoner to the regime.
Yeah, exactly. And you touched on it before as well about Pierre Gasly. Is it too early for him to be promoted to Toro Rosso and that Danny Kvyat lesson that we learnt with him being spat back out after not even a year, like after a year basically of being at the team, and he didn't do such a bad job because he finished ahead of Daniel Ricciardo in the championship, let's not forget, in 2015. So is it too early to promote Gasly? Of course, and you pointed out too that it's going to be a pretty young driver lineup there, 22, 23, or, for both of them. So it's just going to be dependent on that. But if I were Carlos Sainz, I wouldn't go back to Red Bull, purely the fact that he's just going to be marginalised, and we know that Sainz is a better driver than that.
Yeah, I think it does make you wonder more for Red Bull. It's a bit of a quandary. They've made their own bed the way they treat their academy talent there. They don't even get the chance to spread their wings and they're gone, even if it's part of the picture of seeing someone else is coming through, so you're gone, and we won't even do anything to give you an alternative look in. So I think that they might have to look outside the square for the first time, and that's quite a big thing for Red Bull. When you look at the history, maybe Mark Webber's and David Coulthard are the last cases where they looked externally, and clearly they both did their job at the respective points Red Bull were at, but it might be a transitional season or two until they get someone coming back through the system when we dare say Gasly by 2020 or 2021 at the latest will be more than ready to take on that responsibility.
Well, that's the thing, and this is where that talk, maybe does Fernando Alonso finally get a chance at Red Bull come into play? And I guess, of course, Red Bull being with Honda next year, I think Honda will say a firm no to that because they don't want to have anything to do with Fernando Alonso ever again. And that's probably one of the reasons someone said to me that the IndyCar thing hasn't happened yet with Andretti, is because Andretti's with Honda, and Honda as a brand just don't want Fernando Alonso anywhere near them again.
I think that might be one of the few reasons why Alonso's probably making a few more noises about staying in F1, because that goes nicely alongside his WEC commitments, and who knows beyond that, but it might be his only choice if there's absolutely no way of linking up with Honda even as a one-off drive for Indy itself.
Yeah, exactly. So Alonso probably another key player in all this. Does he stay at McLaren? Does he go? As you said, it's sort of dependent on Lando Norris now as well. The fact that with Toro Rosso and McLaren sort of joint at the hip in the whole James Key thing. So do McLaren loan out Lando Norris to Toro Rosso as a sort of bargaining chip to bring James Key over? And does that mean Brendan Hartley will be safe there next year? Because if Gasly goes to Red Bull, Toro Rosso don't have anyone else to bring in, so they get Norris in, a rookie. At least with Hartley, they've got the experience on hand still, so that's one potential scenario. And then that way, depending on what Alonso does, if he stays or does he go, Sainz could come in, and then Van Dorn could be safe also at McLaren.
Yeah, I think for Van Dorn, regardless of where it's at, he deserves another season on the grid, and case could be made that McLaren owes it to him when they've got their act together, but at the same time he might benefit from breaking free from it, as I guess Lewis Hamilton learned. Even though maybe not everyone agrees with his antics, you can just see that they can be their own people when they break free from the shackles, and you just hope he's not lost to the sport.
Well, I get the feeling that either one of the two McLaren drivers won't be on the grid next year, so if Van Dorn, if Alonso goes, if Sainz comes in, either Alonso goes or Van Dorn goes. Van Dorn may or may not, because let's not forget too that Sauber still have that significant stake from the Swedish guys on hand, so that'll be Marcus Ericsson's bargaining chip. And unfortunately, with the sad news of Sergio Marchionne's death, perhaps that gives the Swedish consortium behind Sauber a lot more control of the team, whereas
it does already sound like with Marchionne passing that Alpha Alliance is being loosened a bit. It seemed as though Marchionne was really wanting to ramp it up, and now the successes there maybe want to unwind.
Yeah, so then that'll probably mean Ericsson ends up staying there, and it depends on whether Leclerc moves on or not. So yeah, Sauber could already be signed, sealed and delivered, and Van Dorn could end up with no seat on the grid next year if Alonso stays at McLaren.
That's how F1 works. It's pretty ruthless and no real room for sentiment, and it just shows you that being in the wrong spot at the wrong time, we see all the drivers over the years who go on to be the greats, they've really got to look at things from the true big picture, and it's a game of almost 4D chess there. That it mightn't make sense at the time, but looking 2 or 3 years down the track, it works itself out for those who go on to win their championships.
Yeah, exactly. So Force India, we touched on it, saved by Stroll Senior. Does this guarantee Junior a drive, you could say? Chances are yes, but who makes way then? So I played it out in my head that Checo could end up at Haas now. Grosjean, don't think he's going to stay there next year. And I guess for Sergio Perez, whose decision basically rests with his investors as well, Haas looks like a good option to then have that Ferrari tie-up again as well. Perhaps the more favourable Mexican to have there in Haas, because they were there a couple of years ago with Gutierrez, which amounted to nothing. So Checo and Magnussen would be a tasty little conversation.
Quite a firesome one.
Yeah, quite a fiery little combination, given they are two pretty, not hot-headed drivers, but they do get a bit raucous on the track.
Yeah, there's no quarter given, and you can see the way that Haas is building. Again, they have their moments again that play it out slightly differently, but Magnussen's got that potential with another big year. Who knows if he comes onto that radar from, say, 2020 and beyond. If an opening were to arise, you might yet have a look in for, dare we say, a Ferrari or a Mercedes. He's really bolstered his stock this season, as Grosjean's really plundered his own.
Yeah, exactly. And Williams, with Stroll gone or yet to be gone or whatever, does George Russell make his debut there? So with the Mercedes tie-up, if they become closely partnered with Mercedes-Benz, do they place their junior driver George Russell there after his season in F2 this year? Robert Kubica potentially, does he make the does he make his return to Formula One with Williams finally as well? Because with Sirotkin there on his own, they are in need of an experienced driver to steer the ship, you could say, effectively.
A lot of talk as well that Stroll benefits greatly from Kubica, so we could yet even see Kubica take that seat alongside Stroll at Force India, and then we might even see, as I've been thinking quietly, Ocon to Williams, even though it doesn't seem competitive now, with that tie-up with Mercedes and Ocon being on its books there and very much being the driver in waiting 2020, 2021. You'd think that he's going to surface at Mercedes itself. It could be where he does surface in the short term, and as long as he does get a spot on the grid. But you think that Ocon, Russell, Kubica, they're all viable candidates, and you'd say at this stage it looks as though Sergei Sirotkin there, he'll probably have the other seat, but you never know. Maybe Williams will find a way to break free of the need for financial output if Mercedes is willing to invest in it a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. So with Martini going and the Stroll investment out, Mercedes putting the injection into Williams will be quite crucial, I guess, to their survival. So yeah, a lot to still play out, and I guess I hope you made some sense of our little predictions for next year as well, and it'll be interesting to see who ends up where and everything. So let's move it on to our final part of the podcast, and it's really pressing on. I guess there's been a lot to talk about, and let's do a bit of politicking. And this year, I guess, every year the politics don't stop in Formula One, and I guess this year the big talking point has been about the 2021 regulations and how they've got to finalise them, which it's yet to be done, despite the fact the deadline was probably months ago. We had them outlined in Bahrain, the framework for having simplified power units, of course, without the MGUH, and of course standardised components and everything. But it seems like there was going to be a U-turn somewhere in that as well. So, when are we going to see it? Chase Carey's come out and said over the next few months they're going to finalise it, but, is it something that should have been done earlier rather than later?
Yeah, again with F1, never trust a deadline. It's always just something that's there as a custom, and you can see that it just shows nobody can agree on anything, and it's really quite fascinating when you consider how good the racing's been since 2017 that they can't really see the bigger picture, and as much as they all might want to status quo and say this is great, it has to be equitable for all the participants 4 or 5 years down the track, but that doesn't really seem to be a priority for those manufacturers calling the shots. And that talk a few weeks ago that they'd reneged on the talk of making those changes, it seems as though the more time goes on, the less things will change, and 2019 might be the extent of those changes when they are in actual fact quite minor on the technical side.
Yeah, well, 2019 we learned that they're going to be simplifying the front wings as well to help overtaking and everything, because the start of this year there was a lot of outcry over the lack of overtaking seen, and then over the few races coming after Australia, Bahrain, we were treated to a few great spectacles. So, and going back to the whole regulation change thing, so we saw some informal alliance between Mercedes and Ferrari to try and push for a retention of the current regulations, which doesn't really help any new manufacturers' cause if they want to enter Formula One from 2021. It only pleases, I guess, the current crop, and because Mercedes and Ferrari are on top at the moment, what pleases them will be enough to please everyone, according to them.
Yeah, their hope is just that they can hold everyone to ransom and say, you'll all have to jump into bed with us and form some leagues there, have the 3 or 4 whatever manufacturers. If Honda ends up buying Red Bull outright in a few years, that'd be no surprise, but you'd see them being, I guess, essentially satellite teams, maybe 2 or 3 to each manufacturer there, and that would suit the big ones in Mercedes and Ferrari and to a lesser extent and Renault very nicely indeed.
Yeah, exactly. So what happens, we don't know. There's yet a lot to be played out this year, and hopefully we can get those regulations glued in sooner rather than later as well. More races, less races, the big debate as well, that's been talked about a lot this year. Liberty Media certainly want to have more races on the calendar. They're talking about going to Vietnam, Hanoi, Argentina, South Africa, even a return to Kyalami, and then of course either Amsterdam or
Zandvoort.
Zandvoort, and I think the Danish Grand Prix as
Copenhagen.
well. Yeah, so where does that all fit in given the current races? And what we do know is that the Miami Grand Prix that was proposed is going to be delayed to 2020 at least, and a lot of people said that they brought a lot of negative press around this, saying, that Liberty have failed, basically they should be removed as the leaders of Formula One, etc., etc. But I think it's a good thing, because it seems like Miami's going to be their little jewel in the... Not that Monaco won't be, but Miami might be their little jewel in the crown event that they have on their own home turf in America, North America, and they make it the best race potentially on the grid. So they're just...
Well, it can be a template moving forward, if nothing else, for them as far as stamping its own mark on the sport, and really it ties in with 2021, becomes that I guess threshold moment when it comes under the new Concord and the new regulations, when Liberty can truly say that F1 is its own sport rather than having to work with the parameters that they probably came in under, and there's only so much they can do for the time being.
Yeah, so totally getting rid of that whole the Bernie Ecclestone era, basically, and I guess with the whole Force India exercise as well, we were sort of given reminders about how things were under the Bernie regime, basically tied to the current Concord. There was teams looking at blocking the buyout of Force India under administration, which meant a team would have gone under, but it would have satisfied everyone else.
Yeah, you can see that again. There's not much room for the minnows or whoever you want to count it as when it comes to looking at how it might be for the betterment of the sport. It often gets lost amongst it all, and the big guys clearly that they find a way to come out on top. So you can hope Liberty's able to encourage in terms of teams and tracks, the spectacle. They need to give a little for the long-term picture, and clearly everyone will enjoy the show in whichever shape it comes, 2021 being that moment when you can say it's truly under Liberty's watch.
Yeah, and Liberty certainly have that long-term approach, which is good to see, and they're not all about making as much money as possible in the short term. But just to conclude on, I don't want to see F1 become a street racing championship, like some people have suggested with all these street races coming in. We still need that combination of those traditional tracks, the old school Monzas and Silverstones and whatnot, and of course, if we can get some new circuits on board, or even return to a few old favourites like the Kialamis, or if they're going to use an old track in Argentina or whatever. So yeah, that'd be great to see. But to wrap things up, I guess, any final thoughts on what we've seen so far this season? There's been a lot to digest, a lot to talk about. It's just, it goes on, and, at the centre of it, we've got a exciting championship on the cards as well.
Yeah, it's just been nice to pause and catch our collective breaths for the last couple of weeks, a couple to go, and I think that by the time we probably get to next weekend, we'll be itching to get back into the action, but I think everyone has needed it because it's been frenetic, and that world record of what it was at 8 races in 10 weekends was unprecedented. So I think it was feeling a bit like a marathon. So it was good to just have this little period here where everyone can look at where it's at. And for Mercedes and Ferrari, hopefully it just means that they'll redouble the efforts we've already seen, and you just hope that this time it goes to Abu Dhabi rather than petering away rather spectacularly within the first 2 or 3 races once we return.
Yeah, exactly, because from a selfish perspective, staying up till 11 at night for all
Not
these
really
races...
selfish when we do it week after week to ask a few off.
The whole of Australia basically will echo these sentiments, and then come the end of the year when we get into those North American races or whatever, it's just going to be more difficult doing the all-nighter thing and whatnot. So yeah, we'll see how things go. We'll see how the championship plays out when we return to Spa in a couple of weeks' time. But from myself, Jawad, and from Baden, thanks for tuning in. We look forward to having a little bit of a break before we'll be back to preview the Belgian Grand Prix. So thanks, guys, and we'll see you next time.
Till then.